Good morning to some of you, good afternoon, good evening to others. I want to welcome you to the third in a series of webinars sponsored by the World Press Institute. My name is David McDonald. I'm the Executive Director of the World Press Institute. And as many of you know, the World Press Institute is a nonprofit US-based organization. For nearly 60 years now, we have been having an annual US fellowship program for international journalists. During those 50 plus years, we've had nearly 600 international journalists participate in this program and from over 100 different countries. But that's a little bit about our program. This webinar series is a bit new for us, but we've been having great responses. We had a couple on the US elections, and this is the third of a series of webinars that we hope to continue doing on a monthly basis. I'd like to thank, first of all, some of our partners. And one of those, and one of the ones that was responsible for this idea and is sponsoring these webinars in part, is the America for Bulgaria Foundation. This idea came out of a conference that we had scheduled to have take place in Sofia, Bulgaria in March of 2020, which of course was postponed because of the pandemic. But I'm happy to announce that that journalism conference has been rescheduled for September 24th and 25th. And so we're gonna make that happen. But we want to thank the America for Bulgaria Foundation for sponsoring these webinars and being kind of the genesis. In addition, the Association of European Journalists Bulgarian section has been really helpful in publicizing these webinars. So thank you to them. I'd also like to thank our partners for this particular webinar on the COVID pandemic and press freedom. They are, first of all, the International Press Institute, which is based in Vienna. And that's a global network of editors, media executives, and leading journalists who are dedicated to safeguarding and supporting press freedom and promoting quality independent journalism. One of our speakers is the IPI's Executive Director, Barbara Trionfi. Secondly, we want to thank the Reporters Without Borders, who are international headquarters are based in Paris. This is an international nonprofit and NGO whose aim is the safeguarding of the right to freedom of information. And another of our speakers is the editor-in-chief of their publications and spokesperson, Pauline Adès-Mével. Finally, we'd like to thank the Helsingin Sanomat newspaper and the Helsingin Sanomat Foundation for providing us with or allowing us to use Kaius Niemi as our moderator of this webinar. He's the senior editor-in-chief of the Helsingin Sanomat newspaper. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to the moderator, Kaius Niemi, for a few opening remarks, and also the other two speakers so they can introduce themselves. So Kaius, it's all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. This is fantastic to be able to moderate this seminar. It's actually very important topic we are discussing today, and I hope that you are all very active. Let's more or less discuss about it rather than lecture about it. I think this is also an occasion where I can commemorate my dear friend Sujat Buhari. I'm also a World Press Institute alumni from the year 2003, and we had a fantastic class roaming around the US and learn from each other from different continents. Among us were one of India's most appreciated and well-known journalists, and Sujat actually founded his own newspaper in Kashmir later after the WPI experience, and sadly he was actually murdered a couple of years ago in front of his own office, and social media at the time flooded with condolences, and the governments of India and Pakistan both expressed their condolences to the family and so forth. And I have many times wondered why he was actually killed, and and I think Sujat was kind of a journalist who was a bridge builder, and he organized peace conferences where journalists on both sides of the border met one another for the first time. And I think it was precisely for his moderate, solution-centric approach that he was so very dangerous, to those who benefit from the conflict. And most probably for this reason, he was killed. And surely he will remain a role model and for all of us, his colleagues. Same applies to today's world. I think it's a very, very important and actually exciting and a crucial topic to understand more how the global pandemic has affected the press freedom issues. That is why I'm very, very honored and very glad that we have two very senior specialists about this topic. Let's go to the introductory remarks. And also, if you have any questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to write them to the Q&A section. We'll be ready to hand them over to Barbara and Pauline. So please, Barbara, could you introduce yourself and a little bit tell about the International Press Institute and what's your first feelings about the topic?
Sure. Thank you, Kaius, and thank you so much to David and the World Press Institute for having me on this important conversation. So IPI, the International Press Institute, is a global network of editors, journalists, and publishers that has been around for 70 years. The core function, the core responsibilities of the Institute have been, on one hand, monitoring and promoting press freedom around the world. On the other hand, also using the strengths of our network to support quality, independent journalism. When the crisis started, the health crisis, the COVID crisis started, it became immediately clear to us that this was going to be used as an opportunity by governments around the world to clamp down on journalism and on press freedom. We have seen this happening in so many other crises, in so many other situation where a state of emergency has been adopted or imposed by different governments, even though the conditions on the ground do not necessarily require that. And the crisis became a perfect excuse to actually limit the rights of journalists to cover it at a time when the people need independent information more than ever. So back in February last year, it became clear to us this was going to be the case. And we started collecting data through our network of members, through our sources around the world. We started just collecting a lot of data to try and understand what was going on in terms of journalism, parallel and linked to the health crisis. Obviously, we know at the beginning we saw a lot of countries just shutting down, so restricting freedom of movement, restricting a number of fundamental rights. And we've seen this happening obviously from China or countries where we, China, Iran, typically countries where we potentially expected something like that to others where, we across Europe, for example, where democratic standards are pretty well established. So on one hand, there were a number of restrictions imposed, and while in certain cases it is reasonable to say that these restrictions were not imposed in order to stop media reporting, certainly it was done so in complete disregard about the consequences that these restrictions would have on journalism. And I'll give you a banal example. Lockdown restrictions, everybody's supposed to stay at home and go out just for emergency reasons. In no country we have seen an exception made for journalists. those journalists who needed to, so while everybody, we all were sitting at home in desperate need of accurate information about what was going on out there, the journalists were forced also to be sitting at home and not cover the news. And on top of it, in many, many countries. And so at the beginning, we saw a wave of fines and criminal charges in many countries, also detentions and so on, of journalists who just went out to cover the news, who went out and tried to go into hospitals, talk to doctors, talk to politicians and so on, and understand what was going on. And as I said, in some cases, it would have been intentional. In many other cases, it just shows a disregard for the important function of the media in such a crisis. Anyway, this was just to give you an example. So as we collected more and more data, we created a page, which I'm going to put the link in the chat box. And we started to put also to categorize this data, put them in order, and really try and understand what was going on. And we are almost a year into the pandemic. We have recorded, interesting, 555 at the moment cases of different attacks against the press freedom and against journalists around the world. And I would like to divide them in three broad categories. First of all, what was limited, first of all, is what I mentioned before. So basically, a lot of journalists were detained, criminal charges were imposed on them for their effort to cover, at the beginning, to cover the pandemic. In a second time, even for their efforts to actually cover the demonstrations that were being organized around the world in reaction to the restrictions. So even cover, and we have seen this very recently, you know, at various demonstrations around Europe and around the United States, how journalists have been just simply targeted because of a number of reasons that we can go into details later on. However, so verbal and physical attacks, including detentions, including charges against journalists who try to do their work. The second area of restrictions related to access to information. So as, again, this is a global crisis. People are sitting at home in desperate need to understand what is going on out there. And many countries made specific effort to limit access to information in two ways, either by just restricting the physical access of journalists to parliament buildings, to press conferences, all of that. Governments, even in democratic countries, were very slow in putting in place virtual opportunities for journalists to go and ask questions during press conferences. So basically to question the action of the government. Secondly, a lot of access to information laws were suspended. Again, at a time when governments are taking extreme decisions that may be in breach of constitutional rights, maybe also decisions about economic support, all of that normally needs a very close scrutiny by the press. All that was impossible because access to information laws were suspended. So any request either suspended entirely, or the time for authorities to provide an answer was extended to months. So basically, it became impossible for journalists to use access to information law to access this type of information. And third, another development that we've seen typically of this period of pandemic is the use of first of all, the passage of a lot of countries passed criminal laws to counter disinformation. So there is a surge of disinformation in connection with the pandemic. Countries are apparently concerned about this. The first step they do is criminalize it. Let's criminalize disinformation. And we may all agree with that, but the problem is that, and the problem that we have seen of the countries that have specifically passed new laws in almost all cases, and you can see it now on the screen. These are countries that passed new laws to criminalize disinformation. In all those cases, they were used specifically to actually outlaw information, legitimate information that was critical of their governments. So what is defined as disinformation? Disinformation is that what the government considers news that they don't want to be published. So mostly critical news about the action of various governments during the pandemic. Beyond all that, we have seen an economic, like serious economic consequences on the media. We have spoken a lot about, loss of advertising at the beginning because of various reasons, because of Google algorithms and so on, the fact that advertisements were never placed next to news related to the pandemic. However, everything was related to the pandemic. So newspapers just simply lost a lot of advertisement online, but also offline. These combined in many countries with packages of support of the media because of the crisis that favors exclusively those media favorable, like friendly to the government. So this is just a big overview, and I'm happy to take questions and go into details about all this a little bit more. But the fact is, just to conclude, is what we've seen is government disregarding the function of the media and of independent journalists in a crisis. So basically not appreciating the fact that independent journalism is what will help us get over this crisis. And again, the consequence of this will also be the fact that we are going to lose a lot of news organization because of the economic consequences of this crisis. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much indeed, Barbara. Now, Pauline, you are representing the Reporters Without Borders, and you have a significant data about journalists being attacked and so forth. You have actually published that there has been pretty much same amount of cases, journalists being killed in connection with their work than in a normal year, even though journalists have been much more inside, so to say, than normally. What would you say? And please make your introductory comments, and we'll continue. Pauline, please.
Hello, thank you very much. So my name is Pauline Adès-Mével, and so I work for Reporters Without Borders, a non-profit organization which is present in 12 countries throughout the world to monitor the attacks on press freedom and also to help journalists and defend them throughout the world in all countries. We actually monitor 180 countries per year. We publish an index with a ranking that is pretty well known and used as a tool for diplomatic efforts and for advocacy. And you're right, I think one of the, even though we have the same kind of findings, all organizations together, and IPI has expressed, Barbara has shown and expressed the same concern regarding what has happened last year and the kind of attacks journalists went through. What I find very interesting to talk about today is the fact that we can compare the year 2020 with the previous years. Actually, since RSF publishes annual reports and surveys, we are able to compare the findings to the previous years. And I would like to start with what happened in April 2020, when we published our latest index on press freedom. We had actually identified the fact that the next decade, 2020, 2020 to 2030 would be decisive for journalism, because journalism and press freedom were facing new crises, a geopolitical crisis due to the aggressiveness of authoritarian regime, a technological crisis due to the lack of democratic guarantees, a democratic crisis as well due to the polarization and repressive policies, a crisis of trust due to the suspicion and even hatred of the media, and an economic crisis, of course, we just spoke about, impoverishing quality journalism. And then appeared this new crisis, a health crisis with this pandemic that we had to add to the 5 other crises. And what happened is that when we published our index in April, we immediately found out that there was a clear correlation between the suppression of media freedom in countries in response to the coronavirus pandemic and with the countries ranking in the index. And it was very obvious that the bad countries, those we consider in the very last rankings of our index in the 150, 60s, 70s, were the same actually who started to attack the press and implement some measures to restrict the freedom of press. So China, for example, ranked 177, or Iran ranked 173rd, censored their major coronavirus outbreaks extensively from the start. In Iran, it corresponded to the arrest of almost 30 journalists in the very first weeks of the pandemic. And this happened also in the Middle East, for example, in Iraqi or in Iraq or in Egypt, where there were concrete response. So the first finding was very evident for us. Those countries that we were about to say they were bad countries and had fallen into our index again, were the same countries that were implementing very bad measures for journalists. And so we, as IPI, decided that we needed to monitor and inform more, even more than ever, on the crisis. And so we created a tool called the Tracker 19, in reference, of course, to the COVID-19, but also to the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this project is still on because, unfortunately, we are still monitoring some impact on press freedom and some infringement to press freedom throughout the world. And talking about our roundup and the number of journalists arrested, it is true, thanks to this tool that allows us to compare year after year the situation, we found out that the crisis had been also extremely bad for press freedom. In 2020, there were 387 journalists arrested in the whole year, exactly the same number as the previous year. I mean, only 2 less than the previous year, in a year where normally the number of gathering, rallies, demonstration was less, was smaller. In the year when journalists could not cover in the same condition as freely as previous years, so they were arrested as much as the previous years. So that is interesting. And so I think the good thing was that we were able to compare data from the 10 previous years to what happened in 2020. And of course, I will be happy to respond to any question regarding what we found out from this monitoring of the situation on the ground.
Thank you very much, Pauline. We have already very good questions been made here. So let me start with one. Mary Stuckey asks, what effect did Trump have on press freedom globally and why? And how might that change under Biden and why? So if we focus for a second to the States, what are your feelings if Pauline will start.
Yeah, I think we don't know what Biden will be doing, and hopefully things will improve a lot. Journalists covering the COVID-19 pandemic in the US and their journalistic sources have faced access denials and retaliation for their reporting on the virus. We had several examples from the journalists from the New York Times, ProPublica, that were charged with a criminal also trespassing because of their reporting on a decision at a university. We also saw some medical professionals restricted to speak to the press. I think the retaliation on the press and the impact, the way they prevented the information to be shared was extremely important from the very start of the crisis. And the fact that the President Trump was using the daily briefing for his own purpose and career was also very problematic in the US, and from the very start.
I was just like mentioning that did Trump gave an example for other leaders in the world. What do you think?
No, absolutely. That's where I was actually. I fully agree with what Pauline said. And I think that what we have seen throughout the pandemic and beyond that, you know, also beyond the coverage of the pandemic, also in relation to coverage of other issues in the past years, there is this growing climate of hostility against the media, against journalists being the enemy. And we have seen this in many, many countries. You know, a growing number of online attacks against journalists. In general, also the attacks against journalists covering demonstrations is very much shows a widespread climate of hostility, which is, by the way, obviously instrumentalized and is pushed by certain forces within each country. And what Trump did, he legitimized all that. He legitimized the hostility against the media. He legitimized those leaders, political leaders, be them prime minister, presidents, or simply leaders of political parties who declare that journalists are the enemies of the people, and also basically mixing up the discourse about disinformation, so that nobody really knows everything. You know, what disinformation is for me may be something completely different than what it is for somebody else. And let's be clear about it. We know what disinformation is. We know what journalism is. We know what are the rule of engagement of journalism, the criteria, the ethical standards of all of that. And yet it's being turned into something that, you know, I can call fake news, what you call quality journalism. And so I think that's terrible. And we're going to live with that. Biden obviously will not go in that direction, will be a completely different political discourse. But as many analysts have said, when Biden became president, he said, you know, Trump created a culture, a subculture, which is there to remain, and is there to remain in the United States and in many other countries. And we'll have to deal with that for many years.
Do you think that there is a kind of a sophisticated methodologies now being benchmarked among leaders? If I think about, for instance, the Philippine online service Rappler, and that has actually revealed that there's a close operation and cooperation between the Russian media authority with the Filipino government, how to use social media to retain power and to operate and conduct, you know, a particular operations. Do you think that this is, you know, this kind of a more sophisticated online methodologies that can be benchmarked among these, you know, authoritarian leaders?
I would absolutely say yes. As you know, Kaius, IPI has done quite a lot of research into online attacks against journalists, online harassment, and we really try to go beyond and understand who is behind all these attacks, because the perception, if you look at them, if you're a target of these attacks, the perception is that they come from random users on the net. And yet, if you look beyond that, and this is also what Rappler did, you know, you work with the network analysts and really understand where do all these messages of hate originate, and very often they originate in some centers of power. Now, we know that, and it's no secret that a lot of it, like a lot of the disinformation, and at the same time the attacks against journalists, and it's the same. These are the same players that we are talking about. And it's the same, you know, it's the other side of the same medal. So we know that a lot of it comes from players in Russia. We know that a lot of it comes from players in China. We know Taiwan is being targeted by disinformation and attacks against journalists coming from China, Hong Kong, the same, and so on. But unfortunately, many other leaders have learned how to do this. IPI has seen that being happening and organizing. We've seen mayors in Turkey organizing campaigns of harassment against journalists. Sorry, we've seen this happening in countries like Hungary, typically, and in many countries, you know, you don't differentiate anymore. Where does the what we would define as online harassment end, and where does actually state media begin? Because state media start being full of attacks against journalists who are critical of the respective governments. So absolutely, there is a system behind, and there is a very sophisticated, and then that's why, you know, there is only so much that we can do. Of course, we can strengthen journalists, and that's the first thing that we need to do. But in the end, we will need to cooperate with the platforms and with those platforms where the messages of hate are being disseminated, because otherwise there is no way out.
What do you think, Pauline? Is this something?
Yes, I totally agree with what Barbara said. I think we unfortunately see the same things on the ground. I think it's interesting also to talk about this media bashing, this anti-media rhetoric that is growing throughout the world. You mentioned the Philippines and Duterte, but also, of course, Trump and the leaders in South America. So what is also very important is the fact that these attacks that we saw actually a lot, this wording, this rhetoric that we saw a lot in 2020 regarding journalists commenting or analyzes the pandemic, are extremely dangerous, because those leaders who attack the press so strongly, those leaders who treat journalists in the worst way throughout the world, but you mentioned Orban, Barbara, but of course in Eastern Europe there are some, are very dangerous, because on the one hand they really comfort their supporters and the public that journalists are not to be trusted, and that they can be attacked or treated in this way. So they make it even more dangerous. Plus they contribute, of course, to the distrust in the press, in information, and in a year such as 2020, when reliable information on the virus was so essential for people to know, I mean, for the safety, it was even more dangerous. And I mean, even last week we saw again Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, attacking the press extremely strongly, and still not only because of internal scandal, but because, of course, of the handling of the pandemic in Brazil, which is a complete disaster. So this is also another danger, not only on social networks, but the fact that they tell the public that please go ahead, and it's a blank check, and people think, okay, I can attack the press as well.
Let's focus a couple of minutes on the regional differences. Bruno Lopez is actually asking whether any sort of like clear regional differences what comes to the symptoms, and he was wondering in these times what regional differences were perceived on the type of incidents getting reported, and if the differences represent a pattern. Also, there is a question about like why the Middle East and North Africa the violation seems to be quite low among the statistics. So any thoughts of that? Regional differences and particular cases?
Well, I can start and tell about the RSF findings regarding regional differences. I think what appears in the study of the coverage of the pandemic in 2020 is that all countries throughout the world have been have been creating difficulties for journalists to report. We found out, we wrote about the fact that 90 countries of the 193 UN members countries with superpowers such as China, Russia, India, or the US, but also democracies such as Germany, Italy, or small countries like Kosovo, or islands, etc. Or even in these countries, we registered and documented press freedom violation linked to the virus, to the coverage of the virus, and it was extremely disturbing to see that the countries regarded as democratic models were concerned with these attacks. So no region was spared from the temptation of containing the information. We saw a surge in Asia very shortly, and in Africa, Europe, which was coming shortly after for the number of cases, was less concerned, even though there were infringement of press freedom. Of course, these two continents, Africa and Asia, continue to be extremely concerned, and Asia seems to be with India, Pakistan, China, of course, where the virus was born, one of the main, continues to raise a lot of concern for those studying the coverage of the pandemic.
I agree with what Pauline said. I think that more than looking at regional difference, we should look at countries, which countries reacted how. And for us, yeah, the shocking element was seeing countries that we perceived as being fairly stable democracies across Europe, but not only really developing restriction, as I said, voluntarily or accidentally, but in the end restricting the work of journalists. Yeah, in Asia we have a lot of cases primarily because of India. We have a lot of detentions in India of journalists as the lockdown was declared in the country. Because of the socioeconomic condition in the country, it was very difficult for most people to actually remain in lockdown. They needed to go out and earn their money, and these type of journalists went out and covered this, and these led to serious violations, led to imprisonments and so on. And you know, the data that I've showed you at the beginning has the strengths and the weaknesses of any data set. Obviously, Pauline mentioned China. China is a country that we know the press was restricted before the pandemic. We know now also from the journalists, citizen journalists who covered the early developments in Wuhan, or later on even were immediately silenced. They ended up in prison or silenced, and in other ways. You know, in our data set, these may appear as 3-4 cases of violations, but obviously one has to take this in the context of a country where the press is already heavily restricted. So I think it's really difficult to look at it. That's why in the graph at the beginning, we divided by the type of restrictions rather than by continents, because it's really it's in Africa. We have seen an immense number of violations in Zimbabwe, but less in many other countries. Why Middle East and North Africa has less countries? Well, sorry, has less violations. Primarily, they have less countries also. You know, we're looking at a region with, I believe, 18 countries against over 40 of Asia and Europe, and close to 40 in the Americas. So they're really less. And again, in many are countries where serious restrictions existed before. So government didn't need to clamp down on the press very much because it was there already. So I think that the data was for us really to understand in which direction governments were moving. And as I said, for me, the trends that emerged were this abuse of fake news laws, of anti-fake news laws, the suspension of access to information, all of that are the trends that we're learning. But it's very difficult to look at regional differences in this.
Maybe if I can add some comment, I think we actually have on our Tracker 19 on our website a little map showing that the infringement of press freedom are present everywhere in the world. And regarding the Middle East, it shows that there were cases of attacks or pressure in Egypt, in Jordania, in Israel, in Syria, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, of course. The attacks were different. For example, in Egypt, there were some blockage of the some website, also because they were producing some fake news about the coronavirus. But also in Egypt, we saw some arrests. There were attempts also to close the Reuters office in Cairo at some point. It was withdrawn, but there were pressure on the main news agencies as well. There were also in Syria, for example, there was a very large control of information on what journalists could write on the pandemic, and only the government news agency was allowed to write about this crisis. I mean, for doctors were forbidden to talk to the press. In Saudi Arabia, they were holding some press conference, but they were not transparent at all, and their data was not. The origin of their data was not known, etc. So there were cases either or attacks on pressure on the press, either online with a blockage of the internet or blockage of sites, or just some invitation for journalists to carry on the wording of the government and the authorities, and not to report on the virus and the way the situation was handled by the authorities.
Mm-hmm. Eero Hyvönen asks that it must be pretty hard to actually verify the information during the pandemic. How do you find and verify the information, and could you elaborate a little bit on how do you do the basic research?
Sure. The way we work in terms of collecting and verifying data at IPI is very similar to what any journalist does. We look at various sources. Of course, we have our trusted sources in the country. As I said, IPI is a global network. So in almost every country, we would have a number of members who are very well respected editors and journalists, and they would be able to help us verify the information we get about their own countries. So, whenever we receive any information about a certain type of violations, we would ask other sources on the ground and so on, and that's how the verification works. If we're not sure, we don't post it on the website unless, as any other journalists would do, we believe that the public interest in having this information out, even if we could not verify it 100%, is such that we need to put it out there. But yeah, we use basically a journalistic methodology to verify. Mm-hmm. And journalism in general became more difficult throughout the pandemic. So because many of our sources are journalists, obviously their work has become more difficult. But then I wouldn't say that for us it has become harder to verify information. Actually, very often it has become easier to reach out to people. People have more time, seem to have more time, seem to be available for a fast chat online whenever you need them. So, or most of the time. So I do think that actually reaching out to the sources around the world out of our office in Vienna has become possibly a little bit easier for us in the pandemic.
Okay, there's a comment from Azer Hasret from Azerbaijan that about the restrictions that, for example, in his country, journalists could move just after getting registered through a special government website, and so these kind of restrictions are most probably in many countries now very valid and ongoing because of the lockdowns. And Lenko Lenkov actually asks that what do you think, are they, some of these restrictions on press freedom will stay, do they stay after it, and which of these restrictions have a higher chance to sort of like survive, so to organize preemptive action? What do you think?
Regarding Azerbaijan, the authorities have used the virus to step up pressure on journalists over there and media that were criticizing the government or supporting the opposition. And there were some amendments to the law on information allowing the state to prosecute media for inaccurate and dangerous content. So Azerbaijan is one of the countries where obviously the situation helped the authorities to implement some measures against the press and the journalists, like we mentioned earlier. As per Lenko Lenkov's question regarding what the situation is now, we saw that most of the measures that were set up during the crisis were lifted after those concerning the public media, but also those concerning banning on using certain words, etc., etc. But coming back to some of our reports that we published, when we RSF published the roundup of detainees, annual roundup of detainees at the end of 2020, and we mentioned the fact that 14 journalists were still jailed for their coverage of the virus among the 387 journalists. So still, even though some legislation were lifted, journalists still pay the price. 14 of them are still in jail for their coverage, inaccurate coverage, or their disturbing coverage of the coronavirus in their respective countries. So even though there is a lift, the impact is still present. And since we are still in the middle of the crisis and it is not over, we shall also consider the situation later. And it's possible that these journalists remain in jail.
What do you think, Barbara? What are there any restrictions or measures that could actually stay, and which were the most likely to do so?
Yeah, I mean, additionally to what Pauline has mentioned, obviously the detention and imprisonment of journalists is highly problematic. But additionally to that, one of our greatest concerns at IPI is really the old discourse, and what I mentioned in the beginning is old discourse around disinformation. And so on one hand, there are increasing concerns about disinformation, which are justified, and yet we don't have a solution to it. So there is a growing push, even from the people out there, towards restricting, like clamping down on anything that is called disinformation through criminal laws. Criminalize it, block it, censor it, get it out. And unfortunately, the one element that we are missing is that you need to have somebody in each country deciding what disinformation is if you want to stop it. And so who is that person? And so far we have seen increasingly governments, mostly autocratic governments, stepping up and taking over that function. And then it becomes too easy, because then any anti-disinformation law that has been passed with the support of the people, with the great popular support, becomes the strongest tool for governments to censor independent media. So for me, that is the long-term consequence that we are very, very concerned about. The other long-term consequence, obviously, being a general weakening of the news industry. We're going to lose a lot of news outlets because they will just not survive this crisis. So we had a problem with news deserts before, large regions in many countries that were not covered by the news or by local news organizations. This is going to become worse. So we need to think about solutions on how to fill these gaps, because otherwise that exactly where, and these are many research have shown that exactly where news deserts are, that's when disinformation actually comes in.
Mm-hmm. There's also a very heated debate on the big GAFA companies, the mega technological companies, Facebook, Twitter, and even Amazon. Carlos Taboada Valdez actually asking that, what's your stance on restricting the, for instance, Mr. Trump, to be able to tweet and so forth. What's the angle towards that?
From the start, this is an interesting question, because especially given the context with the platforms recently with Trump, we see that the platforms have means to act, etc. I think the platforms took some measures to combat misinformation about COVID-19. And they proved from the very beginning that they had the capacity to implement structural responses to information chaos. And that was new, actually. And at RSF, we urged them to be more transparent about their mechanism available for promoting reliable information. Because they were discretionary, and they should be based on transparent principle. But we found that during this major health crisis that they were able to have a response to the flood of rumors and misinformation about the coronavirus. There was a confidential US State Department report published by the Washington Post that showed that from January 20th, the date when the Chinese authorities first reported human-to-human coronavirus transmission, and 10th of February, 2 million of the messages posted on Twitter, so 7% in total, were spreading conspiracy theories about the virus. And Twitter promoted verified public health accounts and offered users some authoritative source of information about the coronavirus. So platforms have the means to select content and to make sure that disinformation doesn't spread. And I think for the future is maybe one of the things that should be considered.
What do you think, Barbara?
Yeah, agree with what Paulina said. We have seen the platforms in action doing something that they had refused to do up until now. Specifically, the banning of former President Trump from various platforms was came as a big shock, and everybody has an opinion about that. For me, is more the question of, and Pauline mentioned the word transparency, which is key here. Two things. One is, and it relates also to the banning of President Trump, there was no court ruling about it. Are the statement that President Trump posted inciting violence, were they inciting violence, and as such, were they illegal under the US-American system and blah, blah. We don't know, because there was no court ruling about that. It was a private company taking that decision. So that is one issue that is problematic. But at IPI, we're not worried about that. What we see is exactly the same happening in so many countries with independent journalists. Their accounts just disappear. For many journalists, the platforms have been now for many years, in spite of all the problems that we have discussed, the only spaces they could use to disseminate the independent news. And now we have come to the point that because the platforms are bending to the pressure on them by the governments in various countries, even independent journalists are being banned there. So their information either disappears, their accounts are being stopped, blocked. We recently published a big study about Google News, not Google News, sorry, Google Search in Turkey, how they deprioritize, how their algorithms deprioritize independent news sources and prioritize news sources that are closer to the government for a number of reasons, intentional or not, is something that we are discussing with people at Google as well. So I think that what happened in the case of President Trump is something that we need to make us reflect about the fact that this is what happens to so many independent and valuable voices around the world. And I don't say that President Trump was one or not. I don't think this is the place to express an opinion on that, but there are really so many valuable independent journalistic voices who do not have access to this because of the fact that the platform can just decide randomly without a court ruling, without an appeal process, what to do with users. And that is the biggest problem.
Yeah, same comment on that. I think it's worrying to see the tech giants retain the power to decide whether which accounts, social media accounts, should be closed or not. I think what happened with Trump there, I can see there are a number of questions about the situation following the closure of the suspension of a real Donald Trump account and what happened after. The laws of the public arena used to be established by parliaments and enforced by judges. Are now, I mean, the private sector corporation have now been in charge of doing that. But unfortunately, it used to be the state, the laws, and the judges who used to decide. And the norms of the private sector corporation and platforms are not defined with a democratic framework, with check and balances, and they are not transparent. So we don't want, I mean, the little digital players should not be able to act in this way. I think it's very important that, for example, in Europe right now, there are proposals with the Digital Services Act, and that countries are also thinking about the response to be given to the platforms, because this latest case was very problematic.
Well, there has been really, really great questions, and that is why we are actually pretty much used our time. But I still, if it's okay for you, I would just like, ask a couple of questions more about the future. Svetlana Balabanova is thinking about, how do you think that we could fight this massive mistrust towards media, which was revealed during the pandemic, that there are a large portion of people that are not thinking that media is doing our job right. And then accordingly, there's another question from Julia Blomqvist, who's asking, do you think that COVID-19 crisis will strengthen the journalism in global level in the longer run, or make it weaker?
Maybe I'll try to take the first one, and I really think that your opinion on that, Kaius, actually would be very even more valuable than mine. How to fight the mistrust of those who believe independent media is not there to be trusted. What we have seen in our network are some are excellent examples of how editors and publishers have been trying to address this issue. And we have discussed this very much. Examples from, huge institutions like the Associated Press, and the Associated Press finding itself as one of the biggest news agencies in the world, finding themselves still being perceived as biased, as partial, because they, because they cover news in the way that we know, and which many believe is not is not to be trusted. So that is, but this at the same time is the same question that also local and even hyper local news organizations have tried to answer. And it seems that the answer or the strategies that people have adopted more or less successfully are two. One is constantly explaining to the readers how we do our work. How do we verify the information that we're presenting to you? Can you trust us? And so explaining what is happening behind the scenes and how do we get there, presenting it as part of the news, and there are different ways in which news outlets have decided to share these with their audiences. The other that is also a direction a lot of news organizations are going towards, which is helpful not only in creating trust, but is also helpful in terms of monetizing the readers, the audiences, and so on, is building communities. We know how the information is shared on social media. We trust the information that we receive from people who are our friends, our relatives, friends of friends, or those who believe they're part of our group. So what news organizations are trying to do is create similar types of communities among their readers, communities of trust. And how do they do that? By investing a lot in moderating readers' comments online, encouraging readers to participate in the process, and all of that. And let's have Kaius, you have a much better idea on how to do this as an editor. But these are the two strategies that we have seen in order to create trust. Are we going to leave out anyway big portions of the population? Most likely, yes. So there are barriers that we really don't know how to break and how to cross over. But I think that's where we are at the moment in terms of understanding what works.
Mm-hmm. And Pauline, your final remarks, please.
I think I agree with what Barbara said. I mean, it's obvious that we see the same things, but I think it's important also to look back to what has happened and to look at what, for example, China has provided in terms of information. The Chinese authorities, where the virus came first. There were researchers from the University of Southampton that suggested last year that if China had published the information on time on the number of cases of coronavirus in the country, it could have been reduced by 86%. And if they had taken measures earlier, it would also have saved a number of lives. I think looking back at what could have been done or the way information could have been spread is also very important to regain trust in the press, the journalists, and the information they provide. And we now, almost a year after, have the means to look carefully and to find out what was not known in March, April, and is now becoming public. So this is very important, and especially looking at the situation in China and the way the Wuhan city authorities prevented their journalists to document the cases.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much, Pauline. It has been tremendously interesting, and I think the discussion will continue. There are very worrisome features, of course, and I think we had a good overview now on the undercurrents that are already visible during the pandemic, and of course this will be interesting to follow up as well. Now I'm going to hand over to David. Thank you very much for my part.
Thank you, Kaius, and again, thank you, Pauline and Barbara. I think it's been a great and very interesting webinar. And I want to just thank again our partners, the America for Bulgaria Foundation, Association of European Journalists, the International Press Institute, and the Reporters Without Borders. So thank you all for attending. Stay tuned. We'll be having some future WPI webinars. I expect the next one will be sometime in mid-March. And also this webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded onto the WPI website, worldpressinstitute.org, in a couple of days. So thanks again to all the speakers, and thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. It's been a great webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.